All right, so a quick review of Tuesday's notes, and then we'll get started with today's to finish up the chapter. So, again, we are talking roughly about the 1300s to 1800s, a good 500-year gap there that will encompass the rise and fall of these three Islamic kingdoms. So, with the fall of the Mughal Empire and Mongol Empire in the 1350s, that's again Genghis Khan. The small kingdoms that formed in the power vacuum left by the fall of the Mongol, empire began to re-centralize around, you guessed it, trading centers. So there again, trade routes already established, they become very important again. Again, names of cities that we will still recognize today. So by the 16th century or 1500s, three main Islamic kingdoms had started to centralize. They formed from southern Russia to the Balkan Sea. So this general area here on the map, and it's all actually classified at different times, as the Ottoman Empire. So that's going to be the first one that we discuss, covers this general area here. Quite large as a general area, if you see what I'm talking about. The Ottoman Empire would form such a strong foothold in this area that from their first, earliest days, they would last until the First World War, really 1918, 1919. I forget which year they were treated out of existence. They were eventually known as the sick man of Europe. The empire was, because, old man or sick man of Europe. They were not terribly good allies to have in the First World War, the Ottoman Empire, what little remained of it. But again, they lasted a very long time because they had a very strong hold on, one, a centralized government, and two, we'll get to it. Sorry, I don't want to get ahead of myself. The Safavid Empire at the same time began to centralize and grow out, modern day Persia or Iran. That's back over this way a bit. Sorry, I don't have a large enough map for it. Sir?
Can you repeat that name again?
Safavid, Safavid. And that's the empire. And that was Persia or Iran. So around that same time that we were talking about with the Ottomans, Safavids were forming up over in Persia, modern-day Iran. Art and culture established by this influence is still seen in modern-day art of the area today, and definitely the religions that grew out of the Safavid Empire, or rather the centralization of ideas of a single religion, make it to this day the only nation that has the Shia version of Islam as its state-mandated religion. Starts all the way back in the Safavid Empire. All right. And then we get to the Mughal, Mughal, Mughal Empire, which centralized and grew into much of what is the Indian subcontinent today. So again, on this map, if we could scroll this way a bit, I think you all know roughly what India looks like in your mind, yes? Big area. Well, there you go, another big empire to go with it. They lasted well into the 1840s or 50s. I will get to it in notes, but apologize, don't remember off the top of my head right off. But again, another very strong foothold established throughout India. Very interesting governing system that pitted, literal family members against each other for the right to lead. Like brothers would end up fighting brothers, and then when the one brother came out on top, he executed his other brothers. So, yeah, brutal, but in some ways assured that you got a pretty military savvy leader. So we'll get to it. Pretty cool stuff. All right. So again, what is modern day India is still reflected art, architecture, culture, religion, still very much affected by the Mughal Empire that was established there between the 13 and 1800s. So with the three empires, they were, of course, occasionally at war with each other, but in general, they shared a lot of core values that kept them as trading partners when they weren't actively fighting. They shared a central heritage, Turkic Mongol. I don't want to spend too much time on that because, again, I'll record the notes previously later and discuss it better then. They shared a common faith, which, even though Islam became divided, it was still a very unifying factor for all of these kingdoms and all of the people within them. They shared a common view of acceptance of others' religions. A lot of us today are exposed to a Middle East that has become a lot more less accepting of other cultures and other religions. Believe it or not, at this time, early on in their life, All of these heavily Islamic areas today, which again we don't think of as accepting of others, were very accepting of, sects of their own religion forming, other non-practicing people, other monotheists. So, early Christians, Orthodox Christians, Jews, everyone kind of got along. Not always, but within the time period, comparing it to Europe, where Protestants and Catholics were, actively killing each other by the millions. Yeah, they got along just fine in these Islamic empires. So, with that in mind, keep those kind of core ideas in the forefront of your brain, if you will. Again, briefly touch on the rise of the Ottomans. The empire takes its name from the founder Osman, chief of the Turkic people. Osman's power and land grew through the subjugation of a Byzantine empire, which we will not discuss in this class. It predates, but know that the Byzantines were coming to the end as this guy was coming to the forefront. And he absorbed the Byzantine and others. However, Osman and his followers knew better than to just, destroy everything once they conquered it. They were a little smarter than that, forward thinking. They offered more or less citizenship or acceptance to those that they conquered. So they're not constantly fighting these battles within their own borders. You have happy subjects, then you might get some taxes and some military help out of them. We'll get to it. No problem. This empire grew with both Muslim empires and Orthodox Christian areas, which in the long run will become a problem within their own borders. But again, acceptance. It didn't start out as a problem. And it grew especially out of the Balkan area, which again is this general area right there, down and through there. So that was really the stronghold, conveniently, where they have the Ottoman Empire. That's really, the last vestige in the early 20th century where the Ottomans still exist is generally there. Was always their stronghold. All right, so there we go. We have, again, a mention of the Sufi down here, or one of the early sects of Islam that split off. It was much more in the mindset of a spiritualist style of religion. So they celebrated with singing, dancing, a lot more movement going on in their celebration of religion. They were definitely not seen as mainstream, but again, for the longest time, and depending on which kingdom we talk about, they were widely accepted. Sufism we'll discuss further on, but interesting stuff. All right, so the Ottoman Empire, again, Turkish chieftain Osman, there's a good picture for you, just to give you a reference point. So he divided his state. That is another important thing that you'll start seeing more and more as we go on into developed societies that last longer and longer. If you have a central power, but you have people that you trust underneath you to help run your government, you can extend the reach of your empire further and further. Now, sometimes, especially with some of these early leaders, that would take the form of nepotism, where they would put their son, sometimes daughter for religious purposes, in places of power, marry them up, so to speak, and get them into where they were the political leaders of further on areas abroad. So again, we'll get to it a bit more, but Osman definitely took that to heart. He, hey, new area needs to appoint a new advisor. He's got a son for that. Orhan being one of those sons, reorganized state along more feudal lines. So again, you see a division beneath just father-son. Orhan, the son of the founder of this kingdom, if you will, decided to start kind of acknowledging nobles, people that he preferred, would gift land to. And with that land, you need people to work the land. So underneath the people that are landowners, let's call them nobles, you now start having farmers, slaves, but another recognized kind of social order, hierarchy being established here. At the bottom, you see the term vilayet. That was one of those names for the groupings that they gave for that concept. All right, so growth of the Ottoman Empire. This would happen because of a very early embrace of European technologies that involved, better cannons, better firearms, the use of gunpowder in inventive and destructive ways. So the Ottoman Empire would eventually grow to take over parts of the other two, the Safavid and Mughal empires. They were seen as powerful allies at their height and at different points through history, even for some European kingdoms, Spain amongst them, Portugal at other times. But yeah, again, I'll cover that more in depth when I record the notes from the previous. All right, so who was in charge of this empire, the Ottoman Empire? The term would be Sultan. The Sultan would be, of course, those of y'all that are Disney fans, in Aladdin, the name of the short guy with the big hat. He is, Sultan Jasmine's father. I don't know if they ever give him a name other than his title. Doesn't matter. One of the most famous sultans, and certainly one that I will cover again in your notes, is Mehmet or Mehmed, Mehmed or Met, the second, or I think the two, as I erroneously called him in some recorded notes before. Oops. He was a military king. He was the big expander of the Ottoman Empire. His expansion actually caused some problems with the Pope and some European powers. Formation of the Holy League. Again, I'll discuss it in notes. Stop saying that. Just note that I will. The Sultan was all-powerful. He appointed, one of your vocab terms, viziers. That becomes one of those mentioned in the hierarchy positions. You have the Sultan at the top. You have the Sultan's advisors. I forget the bad guy's name in, again, Aladdin, Jafar. He was the king's vizier. He's the grand advisor. He approaches the Sultan, discusses military, discusses religion, discusses economics. He's that first step down the chain, so to speak. So he is also a vocab term, he being the active term. I don't recall any female viziers. Again, they were typically, royal daughters were typically married into religious positions. So you would have, king, either father or brother, the Sultan, would have perhaps his sons or brothers in other government positions. But if you had any sisters, well, religion was still very strong in government at this time. So it was nice to have a sister who might be the high priestess of some temple or very influential within religious rings, right? It's kind of covering all of the bases. Again, good for centralizing power, though. So the Sultan was all-powerful. He appointed viziers or advisors to keep the governments running in the different provinces, expanding empire problems. Military was kept up with by trained slaves. They were typically brought in from Africa, Italy, or Spain, acquired from Christian families every 3 years. This concept of acquiring slaves every 3 years that the Sultan practiced in the Ottoman Empire was very important for building armies, because you can get taxes in the form of gold, silver, jewels, artwork, etc., raw goods. Or if you're trying to grow an army, who needs, they still made artwork, but generally speaking, for military purposes, who needs artwork? You need soldiers. So when you conquer an area, again, you're trying to do this semi-peacefully. You come to the arrangement. Every 3 years, I'm going to have a vizier come around, and all of you that don't, practice Islam, Christians, etc., we're going to pick your best sons and daughters, and that will be your tax payment to the Sultan. Now, this might not have been the worst thing in the world. These people were called Janissaries, another one of your terms, Janissaries, Janissaries, also in your book. These were the people that were taken as the form of payment. Now, frequently as men, they would be trained as military. They were slaves, yes, but again, they were trained for a purpose, and that purpose was to fight. That means they had to be provided for in a certain sense so that they could stay ready at all times. So a slave, yes, but you are being fed and housed and such, which, better than a lot of slaves at the time. They were just killed or put out in the field. So you had the Janissaries that were men, you had the females, again, put in, or some of the men too, in government positions as scribes, as records keepers. They were trained. They were, in some cases, put through schools. So, again, janissaries, another word for slaves, not great of the Sultan, but they weren't normally put to like field physical labor. It was typically military or to help the government grow. Varied with social hierarchy. So again, people were treated very much differently depending on where they came from within society, what field they filled. So I'll get to more later in the notes on them. To quickly go to the Safavid Empire. Let's get past this. Come on. It's frozen. There we go. Go back. Go back. Sorry, y'all. Tech difficulties. There we go. All right. The Muslim empires in Persia and India, or as we will discuss them further, the Safavid Empire, which is modern day Iran, Persia, again, and then the Mughal Empire, which we'll discuss as India. So the Safavid Empire in Persia was different from the Ottomans in that they practiced a different form of Islam, what would eventually become a different sect altogether. It was very strict in Persia, Iran. After, I believe it was Suleiman, I'm going to have to check my notes, it'll be in the video, established what was called and still is called a Shia. It traced its lineage back. All of the imams, all of the leaders of the religion and thus politics of the kingdom, of the early kingdom, traced their lineage back to early founders of the Islamic religion, like a direct line. That was fine for their faith, but there's only so many direct line people that you can have. So as you get to other empires, you start seeing that, okay, religious leaders can be not from that direct line. And that is what is now called Sunni, I believe, the Sunni line. So took over much of Persia, made it a Muslim state, lasted about 200 years. So again, on scale with other empires, the Safavids do not last that long. A lot of things, lack of water is a big problem. They're surrounded more so by desert. They're landlocked. So again, trade becomes necessarily overland. They're strong when they're there. They don't last that long. We'll get to it later. Reached its height under Shah Abbas I. He was not the first Shah. He was the Shah at the empire's height. Like I said, the structure of their government to become ruler, you were born into potentially, a grouping of several brothers from the previous Shah. You would then have to kind of establish yourself in a military sense. And then eventually, once your father died, you and your brothers were pretty much inherently at war with one another until one of you established dominance, which typically resulted in all of the other brothers getting the axe, so to speak. So rather brutal way in a lot of respects to come to power. But again, you do have a very strong military mindset when you come to power that way. It can definitely benefit an empire. I mean, again, it's not pretty, but it is history. Under Abbas I, he's an interesting guy I'll go more into in notes. Cultural high point in Persia. Again, we still see a lot of the architecture and art styles still today, as well as the practice of a very hardline Shia state or Shiite state now, as it is up here on the PowerPoint. But again, that is a very much, I don't want to say strict in a judgmental sounding way, but it is a much more conservative view of Islam that is still, again, practiced today in modern day Iran. Started right there. So collapsed thereabouts the 1720s. Again, that's one of those times where they give you the 1720s with the S, because there's always that debate over what was the last battle of the Safavids before they were, absorbed by Afghans and others. We shall see. All right, so again, this goes more towards the Mughal Empire. All of this area right here, modern day India, there it is. That is very much where we're focusing on Our last area was over in Arabian Peninsula and Persia. That was more the Safavid area. The Mughals down here, or over here, as it is. Mughal Empire, all right. Turks known as the Mughals from obviously Mongol, which goes back to the Genghis Khan fellow we discussed in previous classes. The Delhi Sultanate, as it became known, would be the high point that we're going to discuss in notes, again, per video in just a little bit. But it controlled most of the Indian subcontinent, and the Muslim leader Babur established the Mughal Muslim Empire dynasty. Again, they were not exclusive about other religions. As a matter of fact, all of these kingdoms frequently, are always in the sense of rulers, were ruled by an Islamic power. But the majority of Muslims at all times, let alone during their high points, lived outside of their borders. So they had huge populations, millions and millions in the Ottomans' case, in the Mughals' case, hundreds of millions, or 1.5, no, excuse me, 150 million in, I think, the Mughals' case. But millions of people, and that many people at the time, a sizable portion of them were not practicing Muslims. So again, another very accepting empire, all things considered, of other places at the time. So Muslim leader Babur established the Mughal Muslim Empire, Indian Empire. His grandson Akbar, later known as Akbar the Great, would, of course, do great things. Mughals controlled most of India, reorganized the central government, which bureaucracy in many forms. Again, that would become the caste system down the line, which any of you familiar with Indian current history is still kind of a thing in a bad way. Castes are very strict social orders. If you are born into a low caste, you are viewed as lower. Like it's socially, you are looked down upon. The higher castes, obviously get the better jobs, become wealthier as individuals. India is very divided in that way still to this day, but one of these early inventions, I guess, or concepts by Akbar the Great would lead to what we now know as the caste system. So again, structuring societies to be more rigid allows you to exercise more control. At this time, more control means raising bigger armies and expanding your borders. So every time you expand, government has to grow to meet that expansion, right? You have to be able to still control. So, yes, sir.
Is that why empires collapse once they stop expanding?
So they frequently stop expanding because they bump into someone that stops their expansion. But once a stable empire starts to crumble, we'll use Rome, for example, go for a history, historic, normal. You start seeing infighting within the borders of an empire that the central government can't control. Kind of a multi-front war starts happening typically. And as that weakens borders, you normally have a stronger force coming in to take over those weaker areas that are in disarray. And the further they push in, typically those weaker areas in the empire from before have realized that they don't like the central government anymore. And as conquerors come through, they frequently will be like, hey, we're going towards Rome. You want to join us? And of course, the guys that are not happy with Rome because they're civil warring already, they go, yes, we will join your army. So you get a lot more momentum. And then when that happens from the outsides of empires, you start seeing them shrink in towards a central point. Ottoman Empire, Constantinople being a very, I guess, relevant to this chapter. But does that answer your question a bit? I mean, disease also plays a big role. Natural events like the Little Ice Age, we'll see, plays a big role in the end of all three of these empires, actually. Damp environment, changes in the amount of grains that are being grown. So you don't have food, can't grow your population, right? If you're not growing, you're normally shrinking. So diseases, 1347, 48 is when the Black Death hits Europe. It doesn't stay in Europe. It follows trade routes, right? So big die-offs never help kingdoms last long. We'll get to it. Good question, though. Thank you. And then a strong sense of national unity under Akbar the Great. So that is probably the biggest thing that a good leader can do at this point is create that sense of unity. Give the people, even if you've conquered them, a reason to feel at one with you, so they cooperate and they want to help things grow, or at least remain stable. Like, again, you said you get to the bottom of India and there's no more room to grow, it's water. So once you get stable in that area, again, you might just be like, hey, how do we make this better? Normal progress. Very good. So, Mughal society and culture, there's that caste system at the top that I mentioned. It continued to be refined. No social interaction between the castes. Again, that is emphasized then. I still emphasize it now from what I know of modern India. I speak out of turn there a bit because I'm not entirely sure. But I believe it still does play a big role in why you have a lot of very unhomed and I guess what Americans would see as poor people throughout India. And then you have people that live very, very lavish lifestyles as well. Is that caste system in place still? Sikhs, again, another one of the religions that I mentioned briefly in notes, became a separate religion off again from the adaptation between, I believe it is Hinduism and Islam, kind of the central god in Sikhism or central religious figure in Sikhism accepts both aspects of religions, both Hinduism and Islam. Very interesting. They're very, not that there aren't Sikh warriors throughout history, phenomenal fighters. But Sikhism is one of those, like, I would love to go to a Sikh temple in India. They feed the masses. Like, if you are unable to feed yourself and you go to a Sikh temple, even if you're not a Sikh, they will feed you at least enough to get by. Those of you who have seen, again, people maybe walking around here, or you go to Atlanta, you typically see a bit more. People wearing turbans. It's typically a Sikh. That's the men don't believe in cutting their hair, so they wrap them up in those very large fabric turbans. Now you might know. You walk down the street and you go, hey, maybe that guy's a Sikh or that woman's a Sikh. Anyway, so they introduced Persian culture into literature with the Rubaiyat, one of those things that historians mention throughout a lot of, literary historians mention throughout history. You have high points of non-historic literature being written, myths, etc., and accounts of daily life, even better, somewhat rarer though. But you have things like the Epic of Gilgamesh getting mentioned. The Rubaiyat is another one frequently mentioned. Drama and architecture, again, architecture is one of those things of all of these empires we still see with us today. The Taj Mahal being a fabulous example. Raise your hand, you've got a mental picture of the Taj Mahal, yes? Giant dome, beautiful artwork all around it, sculpted gardens with rivers flowing into it. Giant tomb, I believe. Yeah. Either way, still with us today, still gorgeous, still influences current architecture. Good stuff. All right, so Mughal society from the intellectual and cultural side, you started having a lot of, again, you have a lot of different religions spawning out of this place. You start having a lot of schools to discuss the validity of those religions. You have a lot of religious schools, therefore, or madrasa, as they would be known in the Mughal Empire. Brahmins, which is still to this day one of those highest caste positions in India, I believe, handled literacy in the Hindu villages. So again, if you can read and write, throughout history this is true, you are always going to get more respect in a society. The educated and literate typically rise to the top, right? Or at least in earlier societies. Teachers are way underpaid now, it sucks. Let's see, you start seeing the new Urdu language in Pakistan replace Sanskrit. Urdu is still spoken today, whether it's still in this original tongue, I know not. However, Urdu is still with us. It is a very cosmopolitan society, as I mentioned on Tuesday's class, and we'll say again in notes, about the Safavids, the previous people. Water limited how big they could grow. You have to have an oasis in the desert to form a trading post to grow into a big city and then a big power structure, right? Well, if you don't have the water, you can't grow. These people followed a similar idea. Water was less a constraint in this case, but I guess geography would have been a big issue here too. So what you see is a cosmopolitan dynasty, or where cities become the preference and focus of the ruling families. So you start seeing a lot of libraries being built, a lot of temples and public places as we would see them now, parks and such, things to make the capital city glamorous. Like these rulers wanted to be known for how amazing their cities were. And that's why you get architecture like the Taj Mahal. Why did they build it that large? Why did that, fellow decide to build it that large? Well, because he could. Like, he had the stuff, he had the money, there wasn't one next door, so yeah, let's go. Like, anyway, cosmopolitan dynasty, aware of local and foreign cultural affairs. So again, they traded a lot. Those trade hubs made the places like that we're talking about here, the capital cities, incredibly wealthy. Taxes, of course, do their number later on too. Mughal economy, agrarian society remained very much undisturbed. So outside these centralized cities, you have grain growers, you have, the farmers, as always. Check my time real quick. 32 minutes, we're good. Rewards for men who served in the government and military. Again, that centralized caste system coming to play. You favor, or you being the people in power, favor certain others. In this case, good military fighters, good generals in that sense, get land, get preference in taxes, get paid off, etc. So you have a very much higher social standing. Peasants were tenants, not proprietors. Do you understand the difference? In a nutshell, tenants work someone else's land. Proprietors, it's your property. So Indian society, the farmers didn't own the land. It belonged to landowners, the typically, preferred Brahmin caste, if you will, or the sultan directly, or the leader directly. Peasants, again, worked the land, paid taxes, and got a moderately okay lifestyle, but they didn't own their own land. It's a big difference when it comes to rights, especially. Village tradition, the caste system and government tax collectors restricted their freedoms. So again, you start seeing the restrictions inherent to the caste system. And then that's it for that portion of what it covers in there. That was more or less the first half of the notes. We got through the big points up until really the, fall of, and I will, again, go on YouTube later. I'll update y'all better in the notes from Tuesday's class when I record again. It'll work this time, I promise. But to today's notes, environmental challenges. That was another one of those things that we discussed that unified all three kingdoms. So natural disasters in all of these places because of the Islamic faith at the time, be it disease or changes in climate, etc. These were all attributed to religious causes. It was the will of God, so to speak. So not that there wasn't a sense of we can't do anything about it, but maybe a little bit. However, just like in Christian Europe, it is known that a lot of Muslims did, when plague hit again, even though it's thought that there was a lot of that fatalistic view in Islam at the time, we see mass migrations out of central cities when the plague hits. So again, history is a little bit biased, especially in modern times. It is now more believed that that fatalistic view was not so much there in Islam from the early days, as we understand it. So the Little Ice Age, as I mentioned much earlier in class at your prompt, thank you again, sir, also occurred toward the end of the high points of these three empires. And again, that was it's Ice Age. You get the idea. There was a planet-wide cool-off. And again, as I mentioned before, you can't grow crops. You can't feed your kids. You can't feed the kids you got. You don't make more kids. It's a vicious cycle. But it is history nonetheless. So as I mentioned Tuesday, and I'll just throw it to y'all too, ergot rot becomes kind of a thing. It's always been around as far as we can tell. But ergot happens when you grow a grain crop, and then there's a certain type of mold that forms on the crop after you harvest it. Because again, these people didn't have metal tanks to put their grains in to keep them dry. Maybe you had clay pots, and maybe your roof leaked a little bit. Your grain starts molding, and it forms ergot, and then you either eat bread or drink beer made from that grain. In a mild dose, the people witnessed mild LSD acid tripping effects. You have a lot of people think that witch trials developed from this concept. Over here or in Europe, ergot was ingested. The people started acting crazy. And if one family's grain had it and 10 others didn't, well, now that one family was seeing things. They were, again, to use a modern term, tripping. So that's a mild dose. Witch trials, obviously, you can see how that would spring out of that. They're possessed. We got to do something about that. Well, on a grand scale, if you have ergot in your grain, a large dose will kill you. So you have these massive die-offs throughout history where, strangely enough, it makes you, apparently, ergot poisoning makes you towards the end very, very thirsty, kind of like rabies does. So you'll see a lot of people in a given area, dead bodies piled around like a riverbank or a pond or something, where in their dying brains with ergot poisoning, they're going, water, and they'll run towards it, and then, sadly, for history, expired there. But one of those things that came with the Little Ice Age is just a side note. So religious developments along with the Little Ice Age were, of course, things that, as we discussed, thank you again, Diego, for the last time, are problems within empires. Being accepting rather of other religions is something that we in the United States all take for granted. You're free to practice your own religious ways. Well, that works in more modern societies to an extent. We're seeing issues still now today. But in these societies, once you start having these major religious divisions, they become a little less compatible with one another, and they're still within the same kingdom, same empire. So they're inherently going to have touching borders, and you have conflicting ideas with touching borders, you frequently have violence. So religious legitimacy and orthodoxy, while we normally take the separation of church and state for granted, in the three Islamic kingdoms, the claim to rule was directly tied to the ruler's legitimate religious status, their religious claims. Church and state were locked, like they were together. Again, do not let modern views of a less tolerant Middle East cloud the truth. While church and state were linked, did not greatly impede the acceptance of others and new religious sects. Again, we see a lot of religious sects coming out of this place. There would probably be fewer if they weren't well tolerated by the powers that be. So while these separations in Islam have created areas of conflict from their beginnings that resulted in wars, we do still see many of those effects today. Again, Iran is still a practicing, by virtue of their government, Shia-run country. It's all the way back. So Islamic views at that point associated the ruler, again, monotheistic in this case, with God. They didn't see, in most cases, like the divinity of their ruler with like Egyptian pharaohs. He was a god. Like, he was there. We see rulers, Christian world, Islam world sees rulers as, at this time, representatives of God, kind of like the Catholic Church with the Pope, if you will, like elected by the one to serve. And to bring peace and prosperity to the kingdoms. So again, ideally, in their beliefs, all three of these kingdoms shared the idea that their ruler was there to bring peace and prosperity to them, not send them off to war. I mean, that was a part of bringing prosperity and peace, but in times of peace, they counted on this guy to, keep it stable. On a religious level, though. So when you have that power, your word is law. I mean, we don't always see that's the truth. I mean, there's levels of belief in every religion throughout time, right? Some people, especially when the state orders you to be, are very observant. But even when you have that belief in front of people, sometimes you get home and you just go, ugh, whatever, y'all. Like, he's just a dude. We all know he's just a dude. He said it was going to rain the other day and it didn't rain. Look, he bleeds. He gets old. So to me, in a historian's mind, I always kind of take that viewing of someone on high as a god in other cultures as kind of one of those, yeah, but what did they actually believe? Because you see a person getting old, right? Like, if they're supposed to be a deity, then age is hard to explain. Anyway, I don't want to digress too much. I already have. The level of association with the ruler and God changed with each empire. However, it's known in Sufism, a mystic sect of Islam, spread throughout the Safavid Empire. Again, there is varying relations of God's chosen one to actual God level in the different kingdoms, but in general. Much can be said about the split between what is Shia and now Sunnism. However, when the split or schism began to manifest itself in the respective empires, again, that split became, in time, one of those issues that would push these empires apart and encourage other empires that were non-Shia, in the case of the Safavids, to push in and try and take over their land. So, progressively stricter stances were taken by the Mughals, especially under Aurangzeb. I always have a problem pronouncing him. He is one of your vocab terms, though. So Aurangzeb, Aurangzeb. And that was around circa 1650. And he was noted to, I put it this way in my notes, not favor the Shia way. So there are several other sects that he was willing to accept. Shia practice was not one of them in particular. And under him, again, his name being Aurangzeb, the Mughal Empire took on a much stricter tone in a religious sense of accepting some but not accepting all. The Ottoman Empire took a hard line as anti-Shia. So again, the Safavids getting the brunt of that from the Ottoman side of things. Ottomans did not like that sect, apparently. All right, so a brief side on Sufism, Sufism, again, one of those vocab terms, one of the sects that kind of is acknowledged to have come from these kingdoms. Sufis seek a closer connection to God through song, dance, and prayer. I mentioned that earlier. The sect grew in all of the empires in response to stricter views. So as views from the government of religion get less tolerant, you're always going to have those people that go, but I want to do it my way, and this is my way. So as those strict views of the empires increased, you start seeing Sufis pop up around in different places. These mystics were not adherents to all parts of Islam, and again, very much ebbed and waned in their popularity. They spawned the religion, and they being Sufis, spawned the side religion of Sikhism, we discussed earlier, turbans, etc. Sikhs believe that a central God does not see a difference between Hinduism and Islam. I misspoke earlier in class about that and said that that was Sufism. I apologize. That is actually Sikhism, which is Sikhism. Sikhism, one of your vocab terms, I believe. So in this religious sect, there is a strict forbearance of alcohol and tobacco, and men do not cut their hair. Instead, it's wrapped in a turban. They also rejected the caste system. So if you are the government that relies on the stability of your government in the caste system, and someone comes along that says we don't dig the caste system, you can see how sometimes some governments might be more accepting of that, and sometimes others might not be accepting at all of that. So just again, keep that in mind. Non-Muslim leaders under Muslim rules, especially in the Ottoman Empire, but to an extent in all of them, there was the acceptance of non-Muslims, like I said, monotheists such as Jews, Christians, and Orthodox Christians, Armenians, Greek Orthodox, several of the Orthodox religions. They were taxed more, perhaps, than Muslims would be. Favored in certain ways. Muslims would be favored in certain ways, but there wouldn't be, again, not to get too political or too modern, but like Germany during World War II about Jews, no Jews allowed, Jews need not apply. You see those signs up in World War II in Hitler's Germany. There wasn't that same sense of animosity even back, especially in the Ottoman Empire, like I said. But there might be a little bit of, again, oh, I see you're bringing this many goods to the market today. Well, you paid this much, he paid that much. You know what the difference was. This guy was practicing Muslim. That guy would have been Orthodox Christian, whatever. All right, so in the Ottoman Empire, centered around Turkey, Rabbi Sephardi, Sarfati, recommended that Jews move to Turkey in 1451. So accepting was the Ottoman Empire that there was a very highly thought of Jewish leader, again, Rabbi Sarfati, Safadi, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, I apologize. But in 1451, he actually recommended that any Jews that felt they were being persecuted abroad move to Turkey, move to the Ottoman Empire, because acceptance was, again, so high. And then in 1492, 1493, very important years for Spain for several reasons, sending Columbus abroad to, find alternate ways to China. Well, here we all are. Number two thing that happened that year, those years, was the expulsion of Jews from Spain by Ferdinand and Isabella. So again, you had another reason for a whole lot of Spanish Jews in this case to cross the Mediterranean or go around the other way and wind up in the Ottoman Empire. Eventually, some of these fleeing people became known as Sephardic Jews. I can go into that in greater detail later. Armenian Christianity, which again will come into play later in the book, also came out of this time as far as they're very important in trade routes throughout a lot of these empires. All right, so let's talk about cultural flowering. This is again generically across all of the empires. Trade in goods increased, wealth, population, schools, and artists, as I said, throughout all of these. All of these increases left their marks on each kingdom. Each kingdom's known for maybe the floral block style of printing known throughout India still to this day, throughout the Mughal Empire. The Taj Mahal, you see a lot of floral prints. That's still very common today. So each kingdom had their own goods and styles that made them unique, but again, massive trading happened between all of them. Shared among them were skills in carpet making, weaving styles represented in the area, Persian carpets, Arabian carpets, still pretty famous today. Shah Abbas of Persia was especially famous for making an industry out of Persian carpets. At times, over 25,000 weavers would be employed in like a single township just to make these carpets to ship out to the world abroad to bring in money for Persia. So again, Persian carpets are heard of for a reason. They were famous for about 300 years and then still on to this day. Painting and manuscripting in very tiny script became an artistic form common to the area. You will see these phenomenal, 400, 500-year-old books that are no bigger than, a oversized matchbook that have each little tiny page inside with a tiny little script brush you will be able to read, especially with a magnifying glass, perfectly formed and written words in a teeny tiny little book. Why did they do it? It's art. It just evolved in the area, but it became, known, especially in certain of these kingdoms, as a defining characteristic of some artists, along with, say, carpets and things. Some of their intellectual advances, besides obviously we've talked about architecture to death, gardens were certainly something becoming more common. We talk about gardens all the way back to Babylon, hanging gardens there. But in these kingdoms at this time, public gardens were becoming a way for the rulers to display their wealth and the wealth of a city. So that was definitely good for a lot of the citizens too. You had horticulture being practiced again, much more. Artistic achievements, we've discussed a few of them. Intellectual advances were coming out of the Islamic kingdoms in math, geography, very important for determining where you are on the wide open seas. You have to have things that were already invented prior to, but star maps become a lot more prevalent now. Cartographic maps, oceanographic maps, maps that tell you where you are if you're an explorer. A lot of those practices came out of these three empires. So very important for world history. Medicine, again, used to be you had to have people willing to chew on plants and berries and try things. You start seeing schools of medicine. Not that they didn't exist prior in history. Egyptians had a pretty good grasp of certain things. Drilling holes in skulls to relieve pressure and not kill people. Practiced in ancient Egypt. Pretty cool. We still do that today in extreme cases. But they don't know that they had the same anesthetics that we do today. No, they didn't. Astronomy, again, becoming another main focus of the Islamic kingdoms. And astronomy being very important for when, again, you are on the open sea. and you want to know where you are and you don't have GPS or radar or anything like that back in the day, you have to be able to use your astrolabe and your star maps, your star charts to go, okay, it is high noon because the sun is directly overhead. I take this measurement, I consult this chart, I look at this map with this chart, and I go, hey, I'm here. Very important for when you're exploring the world. Ottoman cartographer or of the Ottoman Empire, Piri Reis or Rice, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, Pirireis, in 1521 publishes the Book of the Sea, which came with 129 maps of known ports, oceanographic routes, etc. I mean, this guy literally wrote the book, the dictionary of travel at the time, the Book of the Sea. So in 1521, Piri Reis is how I'm going to pronounce his name. I would like for y'all to probably remember him. He might show up on, say, like a larger test grade as an interesting person to discuss. Not in detail, but just in usage. Ottoman astronomer Taqiyuddin Mehmet built the first observatory in Istanbul, or his first observatory in Istanbul, and again started noting celestial movements, which translated to star charts. His name, Takiuddin, Taki, Takiuddin, Yuddin, all one name, and then Mehmet, Mehmet. Again, know that he was very important in astronomy and creating star maps that would be incredibly useful to future explorers. I think we've touched on already the importance of books and literature in this culture, so I'm not going to read through necessarily all of my notes on that and bore you to tears. 1493 saw the first printing press in the Ottoman Empire, though. A lot of these kingdoms, since there was that artistic love of manuscript, were very slow to adopt printing presses. So in that, the people that brought printing presses to be needed in these kingdoms were frequently the fleeing Jews from other kingdoms in the Ottoman Empire's case. If you come to a land that only speaks other languages and you have children over generations and your religious texts start depleting and deteriorating, you're going to need to reprint things. And the printing press had long since been established in China and Europe. So the Ottomans were just very slow to accept it. It was the fleeing Jews that brought it in. Interesting note. New forms of consumption, just to kind of give y'all a few ideas. I think we've got 10 minutes left. Yes, 10:40? 10 minutes? Good deal. All right, so some new things that traveled along those trade routes throughout all of these kingdoms that we still have impact from today. New foods, drinks, and stimulants were constantly being discovered and traded. And by the mid-1500s, the trade in coffee had become widespread throughout the Islamic kingdoms. You hear of coffee shops like, I love coffee, as you may have noticed. I have some Arabian-style coffee prep machines that predate all of the rest that you could ever think of, that evolved very early because there was that growing love of coffee beans. Came out of Ethiopia, so again, very important from trade. Ethiopia in Africa exports coffee. First stop, Middle East, where it becomes very popular. So popular in coffee shops, in fact, that different rulers throughout the different kingdoms would actually ban or limit coffee shops, because when you get together and smoke tobacco, another big thing that was getting traded, together with drinking a lot of brand new stimulants that human brains had never had the likes of before, you start having these radical ideas. And radical ideas getting talked about in coffee shops leads to rebellion. Seriously, it happens many times throughout history. Coffee shops are dangerous places for discussion. But you start actually seeing the regulation of coffee shops throughout, especially like the Ottoman and the Safavid empires. Because, can't be having those rebellious thoughts in those coffee shops stimulated by coffee. You might actually go and do them. All right, so again, without leaning too heavily on something that I think you can all understand, the trade impacted by the popularity of these goods. We still have tobacco dealers today that grow wealthy on selling things that we know are bad for us. And again, I worked until very recently at a cigar lounge. I'm not judging anybody. Tobacco still makes money. One of my first jobs was in a coffee shop. coffee still makes money. So you see the impact on trade still today. Very good. The impact of gunpowder, this would be, again, key to all three of the end of the empires, expansion in some cases, but certainly the end. Islamic kingdoms all adopted firearms early. The first modern use was in the Ottoman siege of Constantinople, which I don't ask that you know the exact date of, but again, just a good point in history. From this point, the other empires constantly competed for the most modern European firearms. And as the Ottoman Empire expanded into Africa and Portugal and Somalia, you see even in African colonial history later on the impact of that early adoption of firearms. Later on, an Ethiopian king by the name of Metternich II in like the 1800s, late 1700s, was able to defend and repel a much larger Italian force, or a very sizable Italian force, from Ethiopian soil, because the Italians came in thinking, oh yeah, we've got the most modern technology and we've got the best guns and tanks and stuff. Turns out Metternich had followed this long line established from all the way back in the previous empires we're discussing now, of arming his troops with the most modern European firearms as well. So guess who came out on top? Ethiopia. Either way, kept out Italy for a little while. They came back eventually. So much of what we know about the Islamic kingdoms comes through the writing of Armenian Christians. Again, I mentioned them earlier as one of the early sects that were dividing off. Armenian Christians. This group was especially mobile throughout the Safavid and Mughal empires. This was because they were constantly being harassed and chased out. But as you are chased out of areas, you find that wealthy tradespeople that bring wealth to areas, even if they practice a different religion, sometimes are left unmolested. And so are small groups of these people of that faith. With that, you always have this trade network that the Armenian Christians have established. Comes back to help them in the end. European trade in Asia and the Islamic powers' response to that, beyond trade for gunpowder, each kingdom became, as I mentioned earlier, known for a certain set of goods. Silk, closer to China you get more silk items. Armenian traders had long established trade routes that connected from China and throughout the Islamic empires. Again, one of those things that saved them in a certain sense, because, well, it doesn't do any good to make your rich people dead, because then they don't bring any extra money. You just take the money they've got, the wealth they've got, and then they don't produce anything else. A lot of kingdoms figured out that's not good for business. So their trade routes literally went around the world, because they went from China to the Islamic kingdoms, from there to Amsterdam to London, from London to Spain, from Spain and Portugal to the New World, from the New World back around to Russia, back around to the Balkans, and then back around into main heart of Europe. So these were literally, again, these Armenian Christians established some of the very first designated worldwide trade routes. I'm not saying they were early UPS or anything, but pretty strong trade routes all the same. And along those trade routes, again, they would establish schools, markets that reflected their lifestyle. All right, so political decline. By the late 18th century, all of the three political Islamic kingdoms were on the decline. In no small part because of a lack of resources, the Safavids fell first. Persia lost most of its central government by 1722. That's when an Ottoman massacre at a city called Isfahan, I will not ask you for that, killed thousands of civilians. And then the Safavid Empire just kind of, it's not worth it. The Afghan forces eventually did take Isfahan, and with no strong political voice or religious voice, and you see this again affecting Persia today, with no strong political voice, the Shia religious leaders became the new voices of, power structure in that area. So that is how you get a still Shia-dominated government today in Iran. Struggles between heirs that I mentioned. You had to fight your brothers, potentially kill your entire family to become the sultans in the Mughal Empire. Bloody business and typically breeds resentment. While some of the best rulers came from power through battle, constant issues concerning who would become the next ruler paired with internal strife brought on by some Hindu groups. That would lead to a very a weakened state. The Persians invaded Delhi, so again you have Persian invasion in 1739, and again many were killed, and the empire basically had to start over. It wasn't until 1857 when the Afghans invaded again, and 1857 would be when we officially end the Mughal Empire of India. So I'll cover it better in notes in a little while when I record, but 1857, end of the Mughal. Ottomans, the Ottomans lasted a good deal longer, and in no small part because of outside assistance. But groups like the British East India Company were especially powerful in India, and Britain was all about creating empire. And to create that empire, they had to take colonies, and one of those was, of course, the Mughal Empire that I mentioned earlier. They were also very active throughout the Ottoman Empire, the British were. And the way that they controlled things in India is actually a vocab term I need to mention very quickly. They established the British to control India, to end the Mughal Empire. They established sepoys, sepoys. Please do note that one. Again, it's a vocab term. Those are basically military outposts where you had British officers coming over and instructing the native peoples how to create a locals army that was then, of course, controlled by British guys on top. So you had these trading colonies get very militarized protection around them, and those colonies, those outposts, became known as the sepoys. Whenever there was a rebellion in India, in the Mughal Empire, in its last waning days, trying to assert itself, guess who fought the battles ending the Indian Empire? Other Indians. They were led by British. So yeah, awful system. Similar things happened in the Ottoman Empire. That was the point of bringing that back up. And you see a heavy hand by the French and the British both in ending pretty much all three of these empires single-handedly, or dual-handedly as it is. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I got a blank page for the rest of it. So hopefully this recorded everything. And yeah.